Hey folks, Blackcross here, and today's discussion video, I wanted to go ahead and talk about something that I don't normally talk about, which is actually Nintendo. Nintendo and me has mixed feelings for each other. For example, there are some games that I like, and there are some things that I don't care much for. But regardless though, Nintendo has had a record over the past few years of kind of either overdoing it or underdoing it. For example, the Wii has overdone it. They've had like a number of like unpopular titles followed by some unpopular decisions and unpopular ideals. With the Wii U, it had a good ideal going. They just wasn't behind the ideal for some odd reason. They just gave up on it so easily. And while some people may argue for what it could have been or what it should have been or something like that, that does not matter now. Why? Because recently the NX has been revealed. Or rather, the NS, being called Nintendo Switch. Now, if you want to check it out, my particular reactions of it, I will be sure to leave it in the link in the description for you below, because that one is not on my channel, but rather is on Delmar's channel. But while we were watching the trailer for the Nintendo Switch, there were like a lot of questions that was finally revealed, a lot of rumors that was finally knocked away. But upon those answered questions comes more questions, unfortunately. Which is probably a good and bad thing in Nintendo's case, because on the one hand, there are a lot of developers who have already jumped the bandwagon for developing games for the Nintendo Switch, which is surprising, to a point to where even Bethesda and From Software are willing to jump on this. I was surprised. Like, of all the game companies, Bethesda and From Software, I guess Nintendo are finally getting back on track with what the game system needs to pull. But if that's the case, that leaves even more questions. Like I said, the console itself has a lot of features, a lot of which has a lot of unanswered questions. So what this video is going to be talking about those questions that have to be answered by Nintendo Direct when it comes up. Or at least before then. Because unless they say what all we want to know, there's not going to be many people who are going to jump on it right away. In fact, I've already talked to several of my friends about it, and they said while it is a great ideal and it looks fantastic, there are still questions that even they want to know. And I think these questions need to be answered. So this video, again, this video is going to be contributed towards only the questions we want answered. And I will give deeper detail as to what I mean by these questions. And hopefully Nintendo, if they do listen to this video, I sincerely doubt it, but if they do listen to this video, take these questions into consideration and try to answer them through the next time you broadcast the Nintendo Switch, to where we can actually know details as to what all we can expect from the console. So the first question that I'm going to be asking Nintendo, and this is a question that I think the majority of people are wanting to ask right off the bat, is what type of engine/program are they using to be able to pull off this particular power? Because after further analyzation, it doesn't look like it has the ability to read disk, which is a good/bad thing. I say it's a good/bad thing because on one bad thing, there's a possibility that it's not going to be backwards compatible to the Wii U. Which, honestly, that's probably a good thing, because if they wanted it to be backwards compatible to the Wii U, that means that there would still be like a controversial argument between third-party developers and Nintendo for programming games. So chances are it's not going to be backwards compatible. But that leaves the question, is it going to be on SD cards? Because if that's the case, what type of power are we looking at to pull off that much data on a small little SD card. Now, from what I know, SD cards tend to load a lot faster than disk, which is a really fantastic ideal and very great. But then that comes a bigger question on that one. How much power are we talking about? How much data is going to be installed? And what type of games is it possible to bring onto the console? Because from what the actual commercial, the first look of the NS showed, was that it was going to be able to play something like Skyrim. Now, supposedly that wasn't technically the real game. They just pulled that off, and they had the permission from Bethesda themselves. So, in other words, that does not mean that Bethesda is going to be putting Skyrim on the Nintendo Switch, but they are considering it, from what it sounds like. It sounds like they are considering the ideal, but no promises, which is probably a good ideal to say, but that does not mean that players are going to have an expectation for seeing Skyrim on Nintendo. But again, that being said, how much power is this system going to have? Like, what type of specs are we looking at? Are we looking at possibility that it is a Real Engine 4 or some form of computer? I don't know all the detail that the PS4 and Xbox One has, but from what people are saying, it's supposed to match up the power somewhat to what the consoles are today. But even then, that's still a shock, because looking at the device itself, the main device is actually the little tablet itself. Not the console that holds it, just the little tablet. Which is pretty outstanding, because on one hand, you have to give credit where credit is due, that Nintendo has actually put some thought into the programming process onto the Nintendo Switch. At the same time, though, that's still going to be a little bit complicated to kind of map your brain around to the ideal that it could work. But back to the ideal, what type of specs are we looking at? The second question would be the amount of gigs that's going to be inside this particular hardware. Now, let's be honest, okay? Let's be honest, when it comes to Nintendo, they aren't really freely friendly when it comes to hardware space. Like, I kid you not, whenever it came to the Wii U, it had, 32 gigs? That's not a lot. In fact, that is nothing. Like, compared to what we have now, from like a 1 terabyte to a 2 terabyte, which is 1,000 to 2,000 gigs for anyone who's done the math, 32 gigs is not going to be enough to pull off a hardcore gaming system. And if this is supposed to be for hardcore gamers like myself and others, they need to up that hardware space. Because if you don't, you're not going to get many games on there. In fact, depending on how they do it, again, this goes back to specs, but depending on how they do it, they may end up needing more than just 1 or 2 gigs just to save one game. They may need who knows how many gigs in order to pull it off. The way I see it, they would need to bump up the game to get to like 500 gigs. I think if they bump it up to 500 gigs, I think that they would have a large majority of audiences being pleased with this decision, because that is a huge up ante for Nintendo consoles. But again, that being said, how many gigs is it gonna hold? I would really like to know, and I know a majority of gamers like myself would love to know, because if it turns out to be 500 gigs or a little bit more, that's definitely plenty. Now, if it's not, that's definitely going to turn heads for people. Like, that's going to be a disappointment block on that one. Third question, and this one's actually the biggest one that's been bugging me ever since I saw it. The ideal that you can actually take the tablet portion out, take it with you anywhere, from literally to the airport to anywhere else in general. That's going to be my biggest question, because the number one thing that people are going to be asking, and I know this has to be the number one thing, especially when you consider the fact that a lot of people who have owned the Wii U, the gamepad only lasts, and I know this because Delmar told me, the Wii U gamepad only lasts up to 3 hours. That is not enough battery life. In fact, that is squat diddly shit nothing. For this particular software, the Nintendo Switch, they would need to have something that lasts up to like 8 or so hours. Sort of like, let's put it this way. If they had the battery ability to where it's like a cell phone. Now, cell phone nowadays can actually last quite a long while. And keep in mind, today's cell phones nowadays, you do however much you're doing, like either music, videos, games, whatever else you have on your iPhone or smartphone, Android, whatever, they can last quite a long while, can't they? Especially if it's brand new. Now, used for like after a year, they tend to fade, but eventually they do last for a long ass time. But that's going to be a big question. How long is the battery life for the Nintendo Switch gamepad? Because that's something that I think players would really like to know. Because they're advertising it that it is going to be a console/handheld hybrid. And if that's the case, they need to describe, or even tell for that matter, the battery life of the NX S. I do that all the time. NX S. Nintendo Switch. You get what I'm saying. Nintendo Switch. I'm just going to call it the Switch from now on. But the Switch itself, that just sounds weird now that I think about it. But the Switch itself, unless they tell the battery life and then what type of battery it would take, they're not going to get a large follow-up either, because that's going to be something that people are going to be desperately needing to know. In fact, if I know anything, I think Japan has a higher follow-up when it comes to the handheld consoles. They use more of handhelds and arcades more than they do actual consoles. But us, in general, there's usually a huge mix. There's a mix between console and handheld users. I think consoles weigh a little bit more than handhelds, but I've never really done a math, much less looked into it. But I want to say that there are a lot more people who are into consoles, but the majority of people who are into handhelds want to know this much. How much battery life is that going to hold? That is definitely a big thing that people are going to be asking. The fourth question is going to be this. And this one's going to be a little bit confusing, considering the fact that really, in all honesty, they never really showed it, did they? They didn't technically show that it was disc-based. So, does that mean it's strictly an SD card only system? And if that's the case, can it play 3DS and DS titles on it as well? And if that's the case, does that mean that the 3DS is obsolete? Now, that might be a head scratcher to some people, but with the fact that in the advertisement itself it showed that the person was putting an SD card into the handheld device itself, it means that it's true that it is going to be strictly SD cards only. Which, again, back to the specs, is a good thing because that means it can load it up a little bit faster. But then again, it also depends on the hardware itself. But does that mean it's strictly SD cards? Is it strictly? And if so, does that mean 3DS and DS console games, such as like, what's a good one to talk about? Crappy Doodle. I can't even think of a DS title. I'll just pick any one that I can think of. Like the DS title from Kingdom Hearts 358/2, and then like a 3DS title like Super Mario 3D World. Does that mean that those two games can work on the Switch? And if so, does that mean that the 3DS is obsolete? If that's the case, then yes, the 3DS would be obsolete. But then again, it may be programmed differently. Like, who knows? Maybe the Switch isn't programmed with an emulator to play those two type of games. Or maybe they have it programmed the same way as the 3DS. And if that's the case, are people going to immediately think, oh, well that means I can use that same game SD card on my 3DS, right? Probably not. Like, the power within that, using it to be able to pull from the Nintendo Switch, that means that little 3DS is not going to pull it. Probably more than likely, especially if it's supposed to be in HD quality. I don't think it's going to pull it off. Not right off the back. I think I would be more happy knowing that I can put 3DS and DS games onto the Switch and played it on the big TV screen. That would make me happy. But again, we don't know that, do we? We really don't know yet. So basically, those are the questions that people are wanting to be asked more whenever the Nintendo Switch was announced and whenever footage was shown and everything like that. I believe these questions need to be answered either before or literally whenever Nintendo Direct comes out. We need details on these questions, and we like to know more about them. And it's crucial, you know. You consider all the facts that you have seen or hear, and it's like we haven't gotten any of them yet. We don't know. We haven't heard it strictly from Nintendo's president himself. We haven't heard it from Shigeru Miyamoto. We haven't even heard it from... why did I forget his name all of a sudden? That name just... Wow, that's bad. That shows you how much I follow Nintendo. Not a bit. Forgot its name, but... Anyway, though, the point is, the Nintendo Switch is going to be a big deal for everybody, and everybody is already hyped up. But along with that hype, there are so many questions that people forgot to ask themselves. And I believe these questions need to be answered from Nintendo either before or literally in Nintendo Direct. And I'm hoping that they will. But anyway, though, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you literally take these questions literal, because if these questions are important to you, and Nintendo actually, you know, explains it, and actually are critical, and they work, then a lot of people are going to be behind it. But if they're against these questions, and they don't work well, then the NS isn't going to last long either. Even with third-party developers jumping on, it's not going to last long if it doesn't work. I just hope they literally take these questions literal, and then realize that, hey, maybe we need to explain this so that way players can get more invested. If we don't, then we're fucked. That's literally the ideal. But I'll see you in the next video. This is Black Rose signing off. Take care, guys.